Welcome everyone, and welcome to Africam4Good, brought to you by explore.org. My name is Russell Gerber, and thank you for joining us for our little discussion today about the painted dogs on this, the World Painted Dog Day. So today we'll be celebrating together with Jamie Paterson, scientific editor at Africa Geographic. It's a great pleasure to have her on the show today, and thank you for joining us, Jamie. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Russell, and thank you so much for having me.
It's our great pleasure, as I said. So first and foremost, we always like to start off this way, but tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do.
Well, so as you mentioned, I am the scientific editor for Africa Geographic at the moment. In my spare time, I am also currently a second-year vet student working towards the goal of becoming a wildlife vet. And before that, I was actually a field guide for many years.
Oh, awesome. Well, another one of the Field Guide Club. There are many of us out there, but we're all trying to make our way in the world. So good luck, Jamie. I'm sure the studies are going well. Obviously, today we're going to be focusing mainly on the painted dog stuff and, just going into some detail about them. As it is World Painted Dog Day, what is your favorite thing, or what do you find special about painted dogs?
I think it's very difficult to narrow down, but I mean, the first thing I have to draw attention to is their amazing ears, because there's nothing like the Mickey Mouse ears of a wild dog, especially when you've got the whole pack lined up in front of you and they're all focused on something. And those ears are just so very expressive. And then you combine that with the white tipped tail and they're just too gorgeous. In terms of their actual sort of ethology, what I find so attractive about wild dogs is the bonds that they share between pack members, and the way that the pack life, when they do have pups, just totally revolves around keeping those fragile, vulnerable little things safe.
Yeah, I think I agree. Some of my favorite wildlife sightings have been those little interactions with the dogs, where they do those little squeaks and squeals together, when they're greeting each other, or even when they're about to head out on a hunt. So I agree. I love those little interactions. It does remind you often of your dogs at home. There's this always ongoing question about, what is the correct term for these dogs? Are they painted dogs? Are they wild dogs? Are they Cape hunting dogs? What do you think, and which do you prefer?
Look, I don't think there is a correct answer. Obviously, the most widely used, I would say, colloquial term is the wild dog, or the African wild dog. And that's generally the term used by most of the conservation bodies. But of course, there is that risk, and a lot of people have raised that gets associated with the idea that they're just a kind of feral dog, or a sort of a domestic dog gone wrong, something like that, where they're their own unique species. So there's quite a bit of research that's been put into the ways that people relate to the different names used for wild dogs. I think it's safe to say we can do away with Cape hunting dog at this stage. I think it's largely falling out of use. Personally, I really like painted wolf, because I think that it combines the beauty of the word painted and the positive association with the wildness of a wolf and the fascination. I don't know if it's just because I like wolves, but that's my preferred term for them.
I think a lot of guides would say the same. That as you say, those two terms together just work really well. Many times on safari, even on the show, we find when we just say wild dog, like you say, people often say, "Whoa, okay, so where did they come from? Did somebody's dogs escape from the neighbors?" And as you said, it would help to clarify things, but yeah, so many names. I must say I mainly go wild dog. That's kind of the thing I would say the most often. But yeah, change to painted wolf, I could agree with that for sure. What do you think is their biggest threat at the moment? They obviously get pointed out as, one of Africa's most endangered, big mammal predators. What do you think is their biggest threat in terms of that conservation effort?
Well, I would say absolutely overall, the biggest threat facing wild dogs is habitat loss, because as their particular preference is to use huge amounts of space. And obviously it's a threat that faces all of our wildlife across the board. But for them, it's a particularly grave threat. And then, of course, once you get that in motion, then you get the conflict with people that's inevitable. So you've got shrinking habitats, growing human populations, and you start to get that conflict. And obviously, the particular threats facing them differs in different parts of the continent and in different places. But everything from deliberate persecution, if they do come into conflict with farmers or people's livestock, they get deliberately targeted. There are places in Namibia where people actually firebomb their active den sites because of this conflict. And then you get the more indirect threats, things like snaring, which generally isn't targeted at wild dogs and is more geared towards bushmeat hunting, but catches the wild dogs in the process. And one of the biggest things as well, of course, with this human-wildlife conflict is the spread of diseases, because they have no natural immunity to any of the domestic dog diseases, things like distemper or rabies. And when an outbreak catches on in such a vulnerable population, you've got a potentially disastrous effect.
Yeah, a huge challenge, agreed. I know, the home ranges of the dogs are so big. Often the game fences that we have tend to not be able to keep them in if they do want to move on. And then you get into these issues with human-wildlife conflict. For our viewers, just to give them an idea, I mean, how big is a home range for wild dogs typically? Certainly Southern Africa, let's say.
I would say, I mean, I'm not sure of the exact figure off the top of my head, but I would say you're looking at anywhere from 25,000 to 50,000 hectares. It's an absolutely enormous area. I know that they've had wild dogs pitch up in Zakuma, for example, and have had no idea where they came from in Chad. And they had no idea where they came from. They just appeared. So there are packs, and especially if they're dispersing, that are covering huge territories or huge home ranges.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny you say that. One of my favorite memories when I was first guiding in the KZN area, I was out on drive with my tracker. We had guests, and we saw tracks in the road and thought, well, okay, it's not hyena. They're a little bit smaller. It's bigger than a jackal. What could this be? And my tracker said it's wild dogs. And I said, well, we don't have wild dogs on this reserve, so that seems unlikely. And drive around the corner, and there in the road were two, it obviously had been a two beta, male and female maybe, who'd broken away from the main pack, sitting in the middle of the road, who'd come from the reserve next door through the fence line. And it was, I called it in on the radio, and my colleagues just laughed and said, well, you're just being a moron. But yeah, we confirmed. And as you say, that they can move in such huge areas, and those fences don't keep them in. And obviously that leads them to trouble. But, that was certainly one of my favorite memories when it comes to painted dogs. What's been your favorite, painted dog experience in the bush?
It is such a tough one to choose, but just as you were telling that story, Russell, I was thinking about the number of sightings that I've had where out of nowhere, it's so easy to miss wild dog tracks, or they just come in from an area you don't realize they're anywhere near you. And I've had moments where, in one particular occasion stands out, somebody asked me specifically I was sitting in an active hyena den, and they asked what would happen if wild dogs came running through at this exact moment with the hyena cubs out and the adult hyenas. I don't remember how I answered, to be totally honest, but I promise you, not 5 minutes later, the wild dogs came running through the den site, and there was absolute pandemonium for a second. The hyena cubs dashed underground, and the adults kind of stood warily at the side. But it was so special and such an uncanny timing moment that will never be repeated. But it was really, I love the way that they have that capacity or that ability to surprise you.
Yeah, like you say, I love it when the animals cooperate like that for game drive and fit in with your perfect narrative. But yeah, that must have been incredible. Where have been your best sightings, and along those lines, where would you recommend for your best painted dog viewing in the wild, do you think?
My best sightings have unequivocally been in the sands, probably because I've spent the most time there. And so I've had these moments with wild dogs and spent a little bit of time at their dens, and that's very special. But in terms of the best wild dog viewing in Africa, I think that Mana Pools is probably the most famous place to go and see wild dogs. And of course, you've got the added advantage that you can actually walk to the wild dogs. You can spend time with them on foot. They are habituated. It has been apparently quite abused in the past, but I believe that the standards have really been raised, and you can actually spend time with the dogs on foot, take those low angle photographs, whatever the case may be, with the freedom to do so. And then somewhere open. I mean, the sands is probably not the best example, certainly not the northern sands. You have to work hard for your wild dog sightings, but open areas, places like the Delta, the Nyati, Kwando, all of those sorts of areas, parts of Zambia, South Luangwa, for example, those are all places where you can actually, if you do find wild dogs, you can really spend time and make the most out of that sighting.
Yeah, awesome. I have to say, yeah, for me, the wild dog sightings in the Delta in particular have been spectacular. As you say, just that flat open area where when they are on a hunt, like you say, in the Sabi Sands, Kruger, where you just see a flash of a tail and then they're through the drainage line and then you can't get around and you have to drive all the way around. The Delta with those flat open areas, being able to drive alongside them, I know some of those hunts driving alongside the dogs is just super special. I haven't actually seen the dogs in Mana Pools, but I've heard exactly the same thing. Those wonderful on foot viewing and laying down in the dirt and getting those great shots. Have you actually done that before?
No, I haven't.
Oh, okay.
I haven't. I've written extensively about it, but I haven't
well,
actually.
Well, it sounds great.
I
think we should get our various employers to send us up there to experience.
I agree.
Yeah,
I think that's a great plan.
Take it up with them. All right, Jamie. So many people on safari, as I'm sure you would have been asked in your time as a guide, ask about domesticating painted dogs, if it's ever been done in the past, or if there was ever any plan to do it. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, you're absolutely right, Russell. It is such a popular question. I think because people look at them and automatically, as you said, think of your dog at home or your dogs at home. They've never been domesticated, and nobody, as far as I'm aware, nobody knows why that is the case. We know that our domestic dogs came directly from wolf ancestors, and that happened at least 15,000 years ago. And it probably happened for very practical reasons. We could use them in some way for hunting, for protection, whatever the case may be. For some reason in Africa that didn't happen with the wild dog. It might be that they're just not geared towards any kind of domestication. I mean, you don't really get wild dogs hanging around camps and raiding dustbins in the way that hyenas often try to do. They don't particularly seem to seek out our company. They don't mind us, but they don't go looking for it. And I don't know if it's a temperament thing. Obviously now it's not something that we would ever want to encourage.
No, sure. As you say, it's one of the few wild canid, I guess, species that we have that are still left in Africa. I know there's the Ethiopian wolf, and a few others, but it's getting harder and harder to see the wild dogs out there. If I just think about when I started guiding, and I'm sure you feel the same, again, the size of packs we used to see were significantly bigger. And they just weren't moving around as much. And I guess that's also been a huge challenge for them. There's been quite a lot of research in various meta populations. Have you heard about that sort of approach to the conservation of the dogs?
Yeah, and it's such a valid approach. We tend to fragment our populations just by fencing off smaller reserves, and they're totally isolated from one another. So to treat the entire African continent, or at least within current wild dog range, as a population as a whole, means that we can manage that population properly. We can help keep the genetics fresh in places where the dogs actually just can't do it for themselves anymore. And of course, as you were saying, with pack size, there's a very strong correlation between the size of the pack size and the survival chances for the individuals in those packs. So you lose the wrong pack member, one of the breeding individuals, the pack splits, and you have a very disproportionate effect.
Yeah, I imagine so. As you say, it's been pretty apparent to me in the last 20 years or so that I've spent a lot of time in the bush. And I suppose we could say that about many species. Some have done really well and tend to do very well without much intervention from us. But I guess it's these species that have these much larger home ranges or territories that are much more difficult to look after. You know, along those lines, Jamie, what are your hopes for the future in terms of painted dog conservation? You know, what do you think, or how do you think things are going to end up?
Well, I mean, I'm cautiously optimistic, as I am about everything else, I suppose. I think my hopes for the wild dogs would be the same as any other naturalist with a passion for any of the iconic species on this continent, is that we can keep them safe, we can guard them against the threats or mitigate the effects, give them enough space, especially for dogs, or at least corridors that they can move between in a safe and buffered way between the various protected areas, so that they can actually flourish. And I think, you know, I mean, what do I think the outcome will be? We'll be successful in some places, and in others we will probably not be successful. And we just have to try and make sure that we get the balances strongly in favor of the animal as we can.
As it stands, I mean, are there any particular areas where we've seen good numbers of dogs or numbers of dogs increasing, as in some good conservation news?
I think that's a very good point. We've got some amazing organizations that are doing some really special work with ensuring, for example, with the metapopulation, with moving dogs around, with conducting education programs. The difficulty with wild dogs is that their numbers fluctuate so dramatically that it's difficult to term a place a success or not a success, because they have such a high mortality rate but a very high reproduction rate that even the researchers actually struggle to narrow down exactly what's happening at any one point in time in any place where they occur in any great numbers. So it's difficult to narrow down one area.
Yeah, fair enough. It's an interesting phenomenon, I guess, because, like I said, in some areas I've seen that, and others, you know, as you say, the dog sightings have gotten better and better over the years with great big packs. One of the packs we used to watch a lot in the Okavango was what was termed the golden pack. This group that had lost quite a lot of pigmentation. It just happened to be their coloration. They weren't leucistic or there was no albinism or anything. They were just slightly lighter in color, and we used to see them often. But, you know, subsequently, speaking to my colleagues, they've all split up into various different groups and different packs now, but they're still being seen. So, as you say, in certain spots, I think it's really been pretty good. And I think you're right. We're going to see some challenges in certain areas, and that's just the nature of conservation, you know. So, but Jamie, thank you for your insights. Thank you for joining us today. It's been such a pleasure to dive into certainly one of my favorite animals, one of the ones I like watching the most. You know, just before we go, you know, for you, have you found over the years that people are more and more excited about seeing dogs in the wild?
Absolutely. I think that is one really positive thing that we can take away from it. You know, it's such a privilege to sit and chat with you about these really special animals. But I do feel like that the word has got out, and people are now not just coming to see the lions and the elephants. They really want to see wild dogs. And that's important because, you know, famously, we conserve what we love.
Yeah, agreed. Without them, as you say, all the other species disappear. But great chatting to you, and thank you for your wonderful insights today, Jamie. Keep up your incredible work at Africa Geographic, and we'll keep our eyes peeled for any info on the dogs or any new stuff that's coming out there. So yeah, it's a great pleasure. Thanks for coming.
Thank you so much.
And thanks to all of you for watching. Please join us next week for another edition of Africam4Good, brought to you by explore.org. Cheers for now.